It is a distinct pleasure and a great personal honor to introduce to you this evening Professor Louis I. Kahn. And I'd like to add, Mr. Kahn, that your presence certainly warms all of our hearts. Thank you.
Well, it's sure a surprise, because I thought I was going to a little coffee clutch, and it turns out to be a clam bake. And it's great. I hope everybody can hear me. I have two microphones and a lot of battery and stuff here. I think maybe you can make out what I say. You know, it's very difficult to speak to many people. I've done it before, but I must say that almost invariably what happens is that it becomes a kind of performance rather than an event, because I think when you speak to just one other person, it can be extremely eventful. Somehow the vectors of one person and another can manage to come to a single point, and it becomes generative, I believe. That when you speak to just another person, you don't feel as though your lines are necessary. That you feel like saying something you never said before. And though I will try, just to amuse myself, you know, not to put the first act first and the second act second, I'll try to scramble a little bit, because that's the only thing I can do. The memory leaves you, of course, to a great extent, because there are many people. But I'm certainly very gratified that everybody's here. It seems as though if you left anybody out, I think that all of this college seems to be here. Well, in saying this also, I'd like to give you a sense of my recent thoughts. As the old ones sort of get worn just by such performances, when you begin to hear yourself say the same thing over and over again, you know, which one is prone to do, you just make up your mind that probably isn't true at all, because it doesn't grow, you see, and it's just true. If it doesn't grow somehow or other, it needs fortification. I think that everyone has attempted to define architecture, and I won't dare to define it because it's really too all-comprising a thing, too wonderful a thing to try to nail down. But I do believe you can say that it kind of begins with a room which has a relation to a person. It seems are the walls when they're far away and the walls when they're close. They make you say different things. I'm sure that in a large place you say something differently than you do in a small place. If you're near a fireplace, or just with one other person, as I mentioned just a little while ago, I think it is truly generative time. And especially if it's a person you don't know too well, that you feel a kind of remoteness in his personal relationship or her personal relationship, that it becomes even more sharply generative, because you feel the necessity of renewing yourself. And for that reason, that which has been dormant, that has never been said, somehow occurs to you. The room, I feel also is defined by the way it's made. It is invariably an incomplete place if the way it is made, this room, isn't evident in the room itself. There's a kind of completeness about it. It isn't just a partitioned off place, you know, where you feel that other parts of it are somewhere else. It's so important to think that a room is a great thing to have happened, and become part of the everyday, path of man. It is why, on the one hand, when people tell you of free-wheeling spaces, you see, that I go back to the feeling that a room, you see, per se, defined, not mobile, not easily partitioned off, something which is like as though it were an extension of self, you see, something which was a kind of piece of self, was made, that it has in the end a superior position in the record in your mind of your path through circumstance than one in which you have just freely moved and tried to feel freedom, and sometimes you don't feel it at all. You just feel a kind of liberty, you see. But maybe there's a distinction, you see, between freedom and liberty. I think very much that the room has religion. Now, a poet, an American poet, who studied architecture and had it deeply ingrained in him, though he became a writer, just in honor of his previous considerations of where his paths of expressions would be, wrote a poem about architecture in which he said many things, but out of it I drew something that I thought was tremendously significant. He said, "What slice of the sun does your building have? And also, what slice of the sun enters your room?" And when I thought of the sun striking the jamb and the sill of a window, and that you're acquainted with this place, that you enter either in the morning or get up in it or walk into it, that you feel the marvel of it. In a room with another, you forget the wind and the rain and the trees and the birds and the sky. There is something about the world within a world which has an effect on the mind. In fact, a room is a place of the mind. It is very seldom that your mind flowers, you see, on Times Square. Of course, you endanger your life so much walking on any city street anyway, that one thinks first of his life rather than thought. But it is something, I think, of, in my mind, of tremendous significance. It has gotten grown and grown in significance, the sense that you are making a room, and that you're making a society of rooms when you're making a building. And if you think of it as being a freewheeling space, which I think is also of great importance today, mind you, I think it is. In fact, it recalls a beautiful time in architecture during the Greek thought and realizations which were new and emergence, a time of beginning, and I don't know of any time more important than the time of beginning. All the extensions that still recalls the beginning are certainly less than the beginning. To think that something can happen when there's no precedent, and something that forms a kind of agreement in the mind which says this is something that must be. It is, no matter when it was thought about, it must be considered as being always there. It's a confirmation which comes out of the commonality of man, which is tremendously important. And so a building is a society of rooms. And you have absolute freedom to say what this society of rooms are. The function of the building is only a kind of start, you see, of what these places should be, that society of rooms. You honor the function without question, but it is only the stimulus around which things gravitate to try to glorify the sense that something must be. This poet who said, "What slice of the sun does your building have?" is almost like saying to the sun, well, you never knew how great you were, do you? See? Just that. Until you saw a building. And it must be considered in another light. I don't want to lose the thread of thought of the room, and if I deviate from it, you just remind me, because I'm going to just fly away for a minute to a different kind of consideration. That of silence and light. Silence is this feeling one gets in the presence of the pyramids. And I don't mean isolated to the pyramids. I would say that many a great work has that same feeling. You felt this silence today, at least a few of us did, when we heard this music. And the sum total of it all is a kind of silence. When Rachmaninoff used to play on the piano, and I heard him. I had the great privilege of hearing him. When he was finished with his work, it seemed as though the entire thing was locked in a cloud above you. The completeness of it was never lost. It wasn't just a passing thing. And there you felt that it had the quality of silence, a kind of wordless voice that simply reflected the inner nature of man, which has this will to be, to express. I say the manifestation of ourselves on this earth, or anywhere we really are, because kind of prevalence, is the will to be, to express. As though that's the only reason for man to express. And light, that tremendous phenomenon, I consider that all material is spent light. As though light was not light, but was a kind of prevalence of the luminous. That it is non-material before it becomes material. And the luminous, the prevailing luminous, grouped in a wild dance of flame, and the flame congealing, spending itself into material. So the mountains are spent light. The streams are spent light. The atmosphere is spent light. You are made of spent light. That part, that generative part, or that you might say ambient of soul or spirit, from which emanates the will to be, to express. Sweeps towards material or spent light. And spent light sweeps to the will to be, to express, and meets in a kind of threshold which you call the inspirations. As if to say that the will to be, to express, meets the possible, meets the means to express. Material, the laws of nature, are the means to express. You are a product of the laws of nature, which made an instrument to express. Out of the kind of thing that you wanted to express, in the same way as the microbe wanted to express something and became a microbe, you as a man and the record of your odyssey through in the making is recorded in you. Like everything in nature is a record of how it's made. In the rock is the record of the rock. In man is a record of man. It must be considered that you know everything really, except that you may have a dumb instrument in the way of the brain that can't quite manage it. The brain is one thing, the mind is another. The mind is the soul in the brain. The will to be, to express, is what makes the brain, that makes the mind. And the brain is the instrument you got, potluck from nature. Because nature is non-conscious. And you possess consciousness, which is a demand on your part. Consciousness is that germ which makes the awareness give you the instrumentation for the will to express, or the will, which originally was the will to be, to express. I was asked to illustrate light, you know. This fascinated people, and they wanted me to illustrate this. Now, how do you illustrate light? Well, you start like a dumb bunny, you know, and thinking, you know, that if you get just a white piece of paper, what could be whiter than that, right? Well, I started that way myself. And I found that I saw nothing. You know, you look at a piece of paper, it's really a white piece of paper. But I noticed, you see, drawings made by wonderful, wonderful people that really knew what they were doing. And I noticed that the stroke of the pen on a white piece of paper is where the light is not. And that was an important discovery, I think. Where the light is not. You make a drawing with strokes where the light is not. So therefore, I had then found that which could express light. Of course, you know, that meant that the less strokes you make it with, the more light, right? And that probably is very true. I probably put too many lines on paper to make it quite as illustration as I wanted to, because actually, I was very, very cautious about how many strokes I'd put down. But it did give you a clue as to how you could express yourself. And in the building that's being made, there is a tremendous spirit, a will to be in the building when it's beginning. In fact, you know, just by the process of building itself, that not a blade of grass can exist around a building site. It is relentlessly aiming in with tremendous spirit to be. I'm talking, of course, of good buildings, not bad ones. But nevertheless, I think they all start with a great deal of hope. Because the building is best at that very stage when the final evidence isn't there. But this will to be is very great. When the building is built, it's locked into servitude. And the building wants to tell you, about the story of how it was made. It wants to. It says, look at my marble. It took me a lot of money to do this marble. I can't, we had a lot of trouble with this, but I conquered it, you see. It wants to say all this, but nobody listens because the building is, working. If you're going up the stair, up the elevator, going to laboratories and doing your work and all that kind of thing. But when the building turns to ruin again, I think the spirit emerges again, you see. And you see many buildings that are just ruins, in which the branches and the leaves grow in and out of the windows. I'm talking about old-fashioned ruins now. I'd hate to think of a ruin of concrete with the reinforcing bars sticking out in all directions, rusting, and various hues of red, you see, as making any kind of a good ruin. And somebody said, a building is only good if the ruin is a promise to be good, you see. And I'm afraid we got a long way to go to make buildings today have that character. But it did have that character. And you have that feeling that the spirit of its making comes back because it is free of servitude. When people speak about the thing being functional, that means it's really suffering, you see, this building. And it must feel, the unmeasurable quality of this building must be felt, and not the functioning, the plumbing, and all that kind of stuff. It is something which is a spirit. It's made out of man, you see, something which nature hasn't got. It could turn over 75 million times and couldn't make a building without the intervention of man, who says something which is inexpressible, I express through a building, or express through a piece of music, or in playing cards, anything, you see. It is man's. Rocks don't play cards. I just throw in a little barb here and say, what does the sociologist think of this? It's fine when one thinks of the nature of man through sociology, yes. Like also history, to extract, let us say, from history, or crystallize all the circumstances out of it, you see, and simply evaluate nature man through what through circumstances has revealed. And this is like a golden dust that falls, and you finger through this golden dust. And if you can, this distillation away from circumstance, and read history through what you have discovered as to the nature of man, you then have the power of the artist, because it's exactly what he does. Circumstance are of little importance to him. Subject matter is transcended into a kind of thing which has its own life and doesn't have anything to do with the circumstance that led to it. Painters of the most gory scenes of history do those gory scenes in joy, because you cannot make a work of art except in joy. It has nothing to do really with the subject matter as it has with what induces you to make that of a portrait of the nature man. Another thought. Is that in the same line of history, or let us say, when a work of art was made and what significance it has in relation to the way of life then as it is now. If you have but to reflect very little, really, that a work of art transcends the time. It's done at a time, certainly. It's influenced greatly by technical availabilities. And it's influenced by people around and maybe you gather something, certainly you gather something from it. But its import is something that's beyond that. The music we heard today, which was written hundreds of years ago, you see, was just as fresh now as it was then. Why? Because it is actually looked for truth, which is different from fact. The truth is, you might say, a sense of commonality. And it is in this that the music is written. There are things that sort of start you, but it isn't what you end up with. So therefore, what is, you must assume has always been. And what was has always been. And what will be has always been. As though today is yesterday, and tomorrow is yesterday, tomorrow is today, today is yesterday. And in connection with such things which have to do with art, with the only language of man, which is art. And everything serves it, including science. Because science only deals with what already is, and is discovered. Science cannot deal with that which is speculated on. It is really a discovery of what is available. And it has only to do with that of nature itself. Science deals not with man whatsoever. Social science, to me, is no science. Social study, yes. Social science, no. The science defies, you see, the strength of the singularity of each person. If only given a chance to become this singularity, we would have the greatest crop in the world, that is, the minds of each individual, you see, which if one can only find the avenues of exchange, which this can bring, that individual with another can, no matter what his degree of education is, see, would startle you with that which presents this absolute personal kind of evaluation of things. You've spoken to people without education who tell you wonderful things. And it's a pity that they can't prime it, see. For that reason, I also believe in schools, the schools of talent, natural talent. I believe a man who dances beautifully and a natural talent for dancing can eventually learn Latin. If you just honor the fact that, and give him the privilege to express through what he does beautifully, naturally, that he will feel like giving something to himself and to others because of this honor bestowed. So all the freewheeling in the world, you see, means little unless some larger recognitions are made regarding natural talents. Schools of natural talents. You go to school where you get the greatest freedom that you ever could imagine to have got. It's the one place where you should not be marked or judged, but you should be severely criticized, yes, constructively, mind you, because that does anybody, no harm. It does no harm in criticism, but tremendous harm in judgments. Judging one man and judging another. I was remarking, just writing up to kind of fortify this idea. I know I took physics in school, and I sat next to a fella who could listen to what the teacher said and put down accurately what he said. Every time I listened to the teacher, I wrote down what he didn't say. I couldn't listen, you see, and write down at the same time. I just couldn't do it. So I copied his notes to pass my examinations. This is how silly this is. Now, if this same teacher would come to me and say, Louis Kahn, you're never going to be, oh, not Louis Kahn, by the way, I'm the stand-in, by the way. And so I say, I'm speaking for him now, and he said, Louis Kahn, I tell you, you must attend classes. That's one thing. Because to be an architect, you must know physics. It's true, because physics, the nature of nature, by gum, you should know every part of it or feel it. See, it's marvelous to know. But to pass an examination in it, I'm afraid not. Because knowledge, you see, when it comes to an individual, it's personal. Knowledge itself is in a book that is yet not finished and never will be finished. And as soon as that's taken from there to you, it becomes personal. And if you impart this personal, you're saying practically nothing. You're saying something to yourself, but not to the other man. You say, therefore, you must attend class. And you'll be examined. But all you have to do is draw physics. You needn't tell me what it's all about. Just draw what you felt physics gave you. And I think I would be very much constructed along the lines of my natural talents. My natural talents are such that I still do not know the size of a brick. See, I really don't know it. And I resist like mad knowing it, because it is not important to know it. For me, for someone else, it's very important to me. What bearing has this in architecture? The spaces, the rooms, you can call them rooms if you like, you can call them spaces, because it depends on just how much you take in as the point of departure from which your creative instincts, your invention, and your attitudes play. In a recent visit to Venice, I, knowing nothing about the conditions, but just realizing that what is happening to it is a disregard for the considerations that were made a long time ago about what can make Venice a daring city in the middle of a body of water, a lagoon which is this big compared to Venice, which is that big. And it's so related to the Adriatic that it allows a shallow body of water, which is the lagoon, to be replenished or to be changed as the tide flows in and out, and wash away renews the water around Venice, and keeps a kind of balance in all the foundations and the flat areas on which you walk. With the coming of industry, land was needed near in the lagoon. Channels were dug for large ships to come in, causing more water to come in from the Adriatic, destroying the balance of this very low amount of water that came in and out and just like breathed. You see, the water had a kind of breathing system, you see, which made that Venice always eventful for whatever time of the day it was. It was a kind of, in a way, a water architecture. It was in which the order of water was considered seriously, as should be the order of wind, the order of sun, the order of structure, the order of construction, the order of time, and the order of spaces, and the order of movement, which are all the orders that must be considered when you're building a town, for instance. You're not designing. Designing is already knowing everything in what you're doing when you're designing, you're simply sharpening up, making eloquent the elements that must be considered. Design is the last operation, and the one that can be assigned in many, many avenues, you see, because design isn't something that is a specialty of one man, really. There it isn't. But the realizations of the inseparable parts is design of one man. That which conceives the indestructible elements that must be there as against some other place where there are other elements, that is something which is the strongest part of a conception. This can be known as composition as it is in music. You know, a musician, when he reads a sheet of music, he doesn't read all these little details. He reads the music as fast as I would turn a page, practically, and he sort of realizes what it's all about by simply realizing the composition and not the design aspects of it, which are the infighting, you see, that goes in there to make this composition glorious, readable, and all that. Oh, it's a wonderful process. You wouldn't turn it over to anybody else in a way. But when people speak about having great teams on things, they can be designed teams, provided, you see, there is some mind that never deviates from the inseparable parts, which can be known the form of this building. The form, which means if you take one thing away, nothing is there. Not just take it away and you have it still. You don't, you see. That could be powerful. And that is a kind of order, an order of spaces, which makes it so. With all these problems in Venice, the factories which are with smoke belching and also all the waste it throws into the lagoon is causing a great imbalance of a lot of things. Just so many things you just think, if you think of the most aggravated ecological problem, that's it. You see, fish, fauna, you know, everything is, and flora, the water, everything you can possibly imagine, you see, is disturbed by this. And you feel helpless. But, you know, newcomer, doesn't have the great responsibility, isn't mayor of Venice, all these things, you know, which tightens you up because of your mayor. You got to talk to so many babies and stuff. So you have to, you just sit back to say, man who just sort of senses that there could be an order. There must be an order to all this, you see. And then you can see an order. It's clear. You just build another Venice, which is a factory. And it sits on an elevated platform with many sieves through the platform, which allows the lagoon to replenish itself and not allow water, let's say land to be made without having things underneath the land, you see, for the water to flow. So you build yourself land, which is not just land, that's all. You can't use land there, because the lagoon must have all this stretch it can, not to make the tide rise too high on Venice. You lift it up, and you set up an ecological government, and you make this estate 3 times as big as it is now. There should be no complaint on the part of the industrialists. It doesn't have enough land to spread out. And then you set up a government, ecological government, in which every element you see is answerable to the ecological needs of Venice, because the land belongs to Venice. So you set up an ecological government, you see, in this estate, and you invent instruments which are called smoke eaters, you see, the like of which I have no idea of. I turned the thing right over to the engineers to find out. But the point is that you make the statement because you have to make the statement. And you must not think of technology if it's ready or not. You must think in terms of an inspired technology, not consider that you have to wait for technology to be on the scene. And you're not the dictator of the technology? What kind of an architect is that? And what kind of a work is it that doesn't inspire a technology? So therefore, you need to say something outlandish and let the engineers who have that kind of a mind scurry around for the answers. But it's got to be the impossible, you see. What is not made yet is important, because we actually live our life with greater acuity where we don't think of need. It's disgraceful not to give need. It's your birthright right to have need. Don't think you're doing anything if you're supplying a need. But if you touch the avenues of your desire, that in which is contained, the yet not made and the yet not said, then you're talking like an artist. And that's the role of man. And so, the engineer has to be the artist too. He doesn't know it, but he has to be really an artist. He's a textbook ringer, you know. He rings the textbook for things. And the reason for it is quite simple. Because he's a servant of people who design buildings. I'm talking about structural engineers now. Because he works for many people. An engineer could work easily for 50 architects. See? And every whim of this architect, he tries to satisfy. Therefore, he's not himself at all. He is just a servant of the architect. Once in a while, you get a peep out of him. But in most cases, you see, in most cases he'll say, look, I don't think you ought to do this in concrete, though it may be a concrete building, because it's much cheaper to do this in brick. Now, he's talking about another architect where he learned this thing, you see, but he's not applying to your building, which can't tolerate it. You wonder what's wrong with his mind, you see, and it's only because his mind is completely razzle-dazzled by the number of servants he must be to satisfy all these people who must be satisfied. So, I suggested this, and it seemed as though to say Venice is terribly important. I said, all the industry in the world isn't worth one giotto. I said, then why don't you consider this as not being a difficult money problem? And if you were to solve the problems of Venice any other way, it would cost a lot more, you see, of what was considered. And industry would like to be there. Only they must pay the game properly. When I heard also the only industry that is in Venice, you see, actually belongs to Milan, because they don't have land enough to go to Venice, you see, and they don't want to spoil their own city, and so they spoil Venice. Well, those problems are very hurtful, because you know when you see Venice, you just love the death out of it. See? That was one thing. And then the building. Consider the kind of building, you see, which they're thinking of doing. And it constantly becomes a stopping point, because the buildings are extremely charming, and they're very delicate. They're lace-like. They're unbelievable, the buildings there. Just plain, sheer exuberance, all the buildings. Joy of living. Everything is there. Now, when you start to do your own scribbling and say it must be sympathetic to this, you find that you've got to be some other than yourself. And I suggested in one portion of Venice that they build buildings on bridges, not in the water, mind you, but on the land. So the foundations are concentrated, and the buildings are above. And that you pick one area particularly where the bridges, these buildings, sort of group themselves in such a way that you get another Piazza di San Marco, only probably somewhat larger. But it's a singleness, you see, of which you can see all around you, as you can in San Marco. In other places around Venice, you lose your way, and that's beautiful, you see, losing your way. So there, now, I would never have thought of doing this in Venice, but somehow or other, because they were concerned about it, you see. And you know that you can't trust this delicate, lacy work to everybody. You see, something has to happen in the establishment of a new order, you see, in Venice, which is Venice, which you say is not applicable in other places, but is applicable there. Now, I am sure it's a dangerous thing that I suggested. It was only a kind of way of stirring things up. But I think that when I went back from it, I didn't feel accused in any way, that I was playing truant, or I was really doing Venice wrong. I hope nobody does it, mind you, but at least you shake Venice into realizing that something can be done. And so it was with the canals, because the canals are not like Canaletto, you see, visualize them, full of festivity. But why can't you have boats which are restaurants? Why can't they be fantastic? You're not going to Europe with those boats, you see. You can make the canal live again just by new encouragements. It's a wonderful place, and those things can happen. It's a very festive place. Now, all these ideas you can put in a wastebasket if you like. See, but the point is that you're stimulated by the problem, and you're thinking in terms of a new order, but not a new design, something which can somehow be true to the water-inspired, you see, architecture of Venice. Buildings that are made in a general construction as though it were a large shelter, and within which certain availabilities, and not availabilities, but certain functions could be put into, something which has been a question raised by architects throughout the world, generalized spaces, enclosures. You know, that Fuller has suggested covering all of New York, which I think if he were to actually give him commission to do it, he wouldn't do it. Because I think he himself would be quite tiresome to see the tetrahedrons in the sky, you see. And I think he wouldn't do it. But this is not his idea, actually. It's induced by people who love him very much, you see. And he thinks that it's right because an architect suggested it. He's one of the kindest people that you ever want to meet. Very considerate of the next man. And really wants to change the world for the better. Except I think possibly the tetrahedral construction, you see, of this dome would be too much for people to tolerate. I think plants would revolt against it as well, you see. I just don't think that people can live with it. It's impossible. But there is a consideration. For instance, if you were to think of buildings which are covered this way. But it cannot be done unless you also think in terms of just what are other availabilities besides the space. If you think of wiring that's sort of surreptitiously put in, if you think of air conditioning that can be hidden by some way or other, you see, and all these surreptitious ways of serving these spaces, instead of thinking of these spaces being made so that you find instruments within these spaces, because no more is it possible to conceal the ducts when you're that far away from concealment possibilities, you see. You would then find that you have whatever they're made of. They may even be made of brass or something, you see, which stays as station points from which you can take off various other availabilities like power, electric lighting, air, and other needs. You see. So you can do it if you just complete it and not just dump your other problems, you see, which are then not part of it. So in the order of making a space, which is very general, think of the new instrumentations in the same way as I said, you know, get yourself a smoke eater. You see what I mean? I have no idea what it looks like, but I visualized a beautiful sort of instrument that looks somewhat anthropomorphic, you see, that sits there in certain spaces on this piece of land to which everyone avails himself to pipe his stuff in. I think it would take years to work it out, but I think it does nevertheless. I mean, you think of it in complete as though you're actually making some kind of an order of spaces, which by reason of what your visualizations are, you're commanding a technology which can serve it well, and then it can live. So those explorations are positively inspiring. There could be a lot of fun to do. So you get trained, you see, you train your mind to the possibilities of this freedom. But when you talk about flowing in and out of these places like an angel, you know, and then you fall asleep anywhere like that, it isn't anything, you see. You're just neglecting, you see, in a sense. You're losing the real excitement, you see, which can come with putting something into being, you see. And there is a great distance between existence and presence. In every work of art, there is existence, but that's before the canvas is made, you see. And then you give it presence. As long as it has existence, it's completely unmeasurable. As soon as you give it presence, you see, you make a big canvas or a small canvas, you use red or green or blue, you see, or you choose this kind of marble against another marble, then you can be subject to criticism, like and dislike. Measurable comes into it, and it's a different quality. That is the reason why a man is greater than his works. When he puts things into being, already his sense is to do something else, to prove that what he's put into being isn't complete at all. That the next thing may complete it, and the next thing may even complete it more. It is why I think also, you see, that probably such great men as Bach, for instance, died feeling he did nothing. And I think he did, because he didn't do the next thing, which is very important. Well, I thought I was going to talk about other things, but somehow one thing didn't flow in the other, and my second act kind of got mixed up with the fourth, probably, and so the characters are sort of floating around the stage without direction. See? But there's an immense amount to talk about. You can say the structure is the maker of light. The spaces between the structural points are opportunities for light, opening, anything you want to call it. And it's conceivable, you know, that you may, in very strongly erected structures, where the points of support are far away from the other, that it just becomes a kind of instrument to support. It's no more a column. It becomes an event in the structure which must, because of its position, supply other facilities. It's the only station point you have. The space itself is free. The station is the point of support. And one can consider that that is a building in itself. In the same way you can say the enclosure of the actual enclosure, the wall enclosure of a space, if you're thinking of something that does not wrap completely around, you see, is availability if these posts are really that which releases opening, then there's no reason why you can't build, if you want to, a Renaissance facade, you see, at will, you see, marching along there to enclose the building. Because the expression, that is, say, the art, the feeling of having said something which is a revelation, you see, that leads another man to do something too, distinguishes that which is the release of enclosure to you in every way you want to. But the making of the large span is something that portrays really the era, which another era cannot make. And you can actually express that which what is has always been in the same way, if you want to. You have this liberty, though you may not take it, because you take it, you upset, you see, the whole structure of the crafts, who cannot make it anymore. And therefore you abandon it. But your mind can be prepared that you can do many things differently. So it's a kind of another inspiration, you see, that arises, or technology that you want to employ, if you call it technology, or method, just this, to make it so that the enclosure is expressive. So do you see how difficult this is when you think of precast concrete panels, you see, which make windows, make columns, make walls, and which, the window really wants to be framed in nothing, you see, because a window is nothing, you see, fundamentally. And to think of making a fortress that holds a window, you see, doesn't make sense. You see. It's too much effort for the concrete. The concrete, you see, that can span from here to there with very little extra steel. It's sort of a mystery, you know, that you make molten stone and put a couple of wires in there and it holds, you see. It's quite remarkable. Then you make it do little windows too, you see. You see, it just doesn't seem right. You know, so you think in the nature of the material, you know, it hasn't got the feeling that something is emerging, you know. And it is really, and fundamentally the word is truth. You see, that the truth isn't there, you see. I read an old article in the Encyclopedia Britannica, and of course, it would be the 9th edition, you see, and where all the good articles were written, and the best illustrations of any subject. And the illustrations are old hat, you know. You find cannons made, you know, the way they aren't made now. What's the difference, you see? They're ingenious things. And there is a writing about Bach, which is most beautiful, in which he says Bach couldn't care less if he was original. All he cared for is that he brought out the truth, what music really is, see. And that is, I think, in back of a work of art, is a kind of truth. And it must be, in every way, fundamentally unmeasurable. And when you think, you know, of the works of Giotto, who groups 3 people together in conversation, and then takes that mountain over there that isn't the right shape for himself, he builds the shape the way he wants to, you see, around these 3 people. So there's no mistake that the mountain is serving the 3 people who must be seen alone. And then he makes doorways smaller than people because he's a painter. He doesn't have to worry about anybody walking through those doors. And in the same way as Chagall would paint people upside down because he also doesn't care about gravity. But as a sculptor, he can make square wheels on a cannon to express the futility of war. He can do it. But if you're in war, you've got to use round wheels. Otherwise, I'm afraid you lose the battle. So you have, but the prerogatives are different, you see, and the expressions are different. And you have tremendous prerogative within the sphere in which you're working. An architect, too, must use round wheels, otherwise he won't cart things from place to place. In the same way, the architect must make doorways bigger than people, because especially now, when the basketball players are becoming taller and taller. And so, but the prerogatives are then different in the art, you see, but the art tries, you see, really for the incredible. It really tries for the incredible. I know if I would be asked, you know, what I would like to be other than be an architect, I would say, I would love to write the new fairy tales. Because they are tremendously inspiring. You can say that the wish in the fairy tale is the beginning of science. You know how true that is. Because when 10 people impinge on you in a black alley, you wish you would disappear, right? And I think you're trying for that. I think that the airplane, for instance, I think it's incomplete, really. I don't care if it's, what is it, that big one, 747? It doesn't matter how big it is. It's not as good as a flying carpet. Because after all, you know, you have to pay a fee, you know, and you have to have a pilot, and you have to have gas, and you have to have all kinds of things, and towers and airports. You see, all those things are just attachments, you see, which are not really true to man. Man once regrets the fact that he made a decision somewhere down the line which gave him no wings, and he can't get over it. And so he does, yeah, it's in his nature, you see. Of course, I forgot we were talking about architecture. That happens every once in a while. And you have There's one thing which, in realizing the difference between shape and form, I think they're interchangeable in meaning. But for the sake of reaching for clarity, one can say that form is something of a realization of inseparable parts. And shape is what you choose to express it. Like if you realize what an axe is by saying it's a sharp edge and a butt end to the axe, to the sharp edge, and a handle, just a handle to begin with, you have realized the inseparable parts of form, axe. How you design it, if the man realizes the handle, the longer it is, the better is the axe swing of the axe. He's a better designer than the man who made the axe too short. If he's felling a tree, for instance, of certain weight. So design is really the choice of the material, the nature of the material, the shape of its parts is what design is. And form is a realization of the inseparable aspects of your design, of your presentation. And there is a big difference. I would say, in speaking of the time of light, you see, or rather silence and light, or the will to be, to express, and the means to express, forming a kind of exchange. Because if you think of it, you know, it must all have come from the same source. Nature of nature, the material end of it, and that which is spiritual. You cannot say that they're really dichotomous. Though for explanation you might say so. But I have the feeling that it's really one source, that for the moment you can say are brothers, a brother, a brother. Not two brothers, but a brother and a brother, you see, not making a distinction. One that tended to the will to be, to express, and the others are, that is to say, to be, to make. And to be, to make became the luminous. And to be, to the will to be, the will, which is different from to be, the will to be, to make, or to express, the will to be, to express, as being a non-luminous, just, you might say, in a kind of limbo, a kind of darkness, a kind of silence, you see. The other is luminous, the other is dark, sort of not seeking the luminous, you see. And in this sense, there is the first feeling, which you might say is inspiration, is that of beauty. The sense beauty, which means to me just a kind of overwhelming harmony, inexplicable, undefinable, unmeasurable. You might say it's the first word that wasn't a word. And those words, which are unmeasurable words, you see, are the most precious in our language. And as soon as you try to measure those words which are so precious, you find yourself getting less than the word which you might say begins to be precious as that which tells you of the unmeasurable quality. For instance, suppose you said good, which is really an unmeasurable word. But if you say very good, it's really less than good. Mustn't we look at our language again and think about it a little bit? So we don't mix, you see, the powerful words, you see, which are so pure without the modifications. Very good. Is that better than good? No. Good transcends, goes right across. And so it is, in good there's beauty. You can sense both words coming together. Very good, beauty disappears. But the word beauty, you see, is a beautiful thing. That sounds kind of corny, but it is just. Beauty. Then from beauty, you would say from beauty there is wonder, comes after beauty. Wonder. From wonder, there's kind of realization. Ah, you see, kind of feeling from wonder. And from that would come form. Form being that which, out of the realization, you can say, yes, I realize there are three, there are two, there's something like that. See? And then, you see, in the making, you're applying shape or the word, anything. Shape is already a word, you see. It is somehow something that can be uttered and can bring you communication. That, and I think, you know, beginning is a powerful thing. If you stop to think of it, you know, that if you think of the beginning, you really wonder, you see, about this, you see, the fact that a violin was made. Think of it. That's fantastic, a violin. Who could put these things together? And if you ever see one made, with the caution that must be made, meaning the choice of the wood, you know, and the realization of sound, and all these things that come out of this thing, it cannot be anything but that which must have been something written, you see, what needed an instrument just like we, you see, desired an instrument of expression. So is this made by man, not by nature, you see, which found the secret biologically to make, let's see, living things. And so this is not a living thing, though it's made from living things. That is this. So the sense of wonder, and somehow rather one of the things that I cannot forget and cannot take out of my mind, the one thing that did not disappear was Beethoven's Fifth Symphony somehow. It's because it is so tremendously abstract, so unattached, you see, to things material. Though it was closer to that which had to do with man and music than was Bach's work, and certainly Staccato and Fugue and the works of the artists. And then you pick them out. You can sort of get the highlights. It comes to you. You see those things that were tremendously significant. I think the Parthenon is one of those. People, you know, think of this. San Marco began to be on trial. Look how marvelous it is. Still on trial compared, you see, to those things. Because what is the Parthenon? But to me, you see, it is as though a man somehow, and never it is a crowd. You don't speak about creation, you speak about collaboration at the same time. That's not possible. It's only possible when you are designing, when you are making each element, you see, great, because you must employ many people. You must employ that which is specialties, men who have worked in their own predilections in their own way, and they must come to you for advice to make these design, you see, a glorification of the elements which you concede are inseparable. And so, that music, because of its abstract quality, just out of the depths of man's nature, you see, that these things come. They must be regarded with the highest honor, you know, those works that just came out of the blue. And they're in the nature of man. And from it you discover your own nature. One day a student asks, what is the intuitive sense? And I turned that question right over to Mr. Loricole, you know, who is a marvelous mathematician, engineer, constructivist. And he has a way of sort of hemming and hawing a bit, you know, when he's speaking about things, because he wants to tantalize you a bit. And he says, intuition Well, the way to think is maybe, well, how was the first thing made? Certainly was not made out of knowledge. But he says, intuition must be fed. Oh, he says, well, to sum it up, it all begins with poetry. And I think he's terribly right. I think it's no use speaking about things like spaces served and spaces that do the serving, because I think it's rather now an obvious lesson. It's a kind of thing, however, is good to speak of in one sense, that the greatest part of your work is that part of your work which you can claim ownership to. It's the part that transcends your expression. And so it is with Bach's music, which you can almost exclude Mr. Bach out of it. You don't know what he looks like, really. And show you a picture of it, you would believe any picture of him that's put before you. His music, you see, is fundamental. It belongs really to music. And you can say it this way, in a sense, that if a dish fell in Mozart's kitchen, for instance, the servants would shriek, you see, because the noise was deafening in this stone floor, which I'm sure he had, you see. But Mozart said, dissonance, you see. And he saw it belonging to music. You see. But it belongs to music, not to him, not at all. Dissonance belongs at that moment to everybody. But he made a composition which gave forth its beauty. And so one saw through that his own way in which dissonance can enter music. And so it is with things that one discovers, you see, in his work, which in whatever little ways that I have thought about things as belonging not to me, but which motivated my work to have direction, you see, is the part that really is of greatest value in the end, is that which really belongs essentially to music, if you are writing music, and to architecture when you're doing architecture. You can say without question, that architecture has no presence whatsoever, and it doesn't. What is present is a work of architecture, which you present or offer to architecture. Thank you very much.